واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائما قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اللهم صل على محمد.
Thank you, Brother Hussein. As always, a beautiful recitation. Can we please have another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? Inshallah, now we'll be continuing on to our main segment presented by our brother Amir Saleh, named Embarking on the Journey of Life through Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف النبيين حبيب الله رب العالمين بالقاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I'm happy to have you all here today. Let's have a quick refresher of what we talked about a year ago last time. It'll help us with understanding what we're going to be talking about this time, inshallah. So last time we spoke about how we should understand our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I took you guys through a story of this man who was a practicing Muslim, and yet he didn't really understand what his connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should really be. And then we talked about it over and over again, and we reached this conclusion that it's a connection of this lover and the beloved, this connection of love and mercy between us and the Muslimin, us and Allah, sorry. And then we also understood, and this part is important for this speech, that we have a ruh, and this ruh is a soul intrinsic to us, and it allows us to have this further connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's actually something specific to the human that we can develop and reach closeness to Allah. And that's where we left off. Inshallah, today we'll speak about something with equal merit to what we talked, and that's the way that we should be conducting our life in this dunya. So inshallah, I'd like to speak about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us is hayatul dunya. And then I want to look at the alternative to living in hayatul dunya, this other way that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then inshallah we can also talk about how we can develop ourselves in order to reach the akhirah and reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So can we begin with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So again, like last time, you guys told me you really liked the story, so we'll have another story this time as well. So let's imagine a Muslim. He lives quite a stable life, it's a quite happy life, and really close your eyes and try to imagine this story. So there's this Muslim who's living a happy, stable life. He goes to work, he saves up some money, and there's not much to worry about. And yet he feels like the world is dull and it's uninteresting and it's not something special. He doesn't feel, when he hears the stories of the Imams and the Prophets and they had those such special lives, he doesn't experience that special life that he reads of. And he wonders, he knows that this dunya is a distraction and it shouldn't be special, and yet he thinks, is life supposed to be this way? Should it be so disconnected to the dunya and so disconnected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So now let's try go through this man's story and try to understand the connection to this dunya and the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So first he thinks of the qunut he makes, and this qunut is from Surah Al-Baqarah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Now he thinks about this qunut that he makes, he's pondering about it. And in English it's, "Oh Lord, give us the good in this world and the good in the hereafter, and guard us from the punishment of the fire." He reads here something that he finds to be a contradiction to what he's understood so far. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that we are asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for good both in this world and the hereafter, but usually he thinks that there's no good in this world. He thinks this dunya is evil. And yet he wonders, how can there be good in this world? And if there is evil or if there is bad in this dunya, what is exactly the thing that causes that badness in this dunya? So he wonders, what is the bad side? Beautifully, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers this question over and over again in the Quran. It actually comes up so many times. This exact one that I'm going to read out is from Surah Al-Hadid, ayah 20. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, اعلموا إنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. Know that this life is just la'ab and lahu and zina and tafakhur among you and takathur for wealth and children. I will go through what these mean. But before we go into that, let's look at the start of the ayah, which says, اعلموا إنما الحياة الدنيا. Know that the life of this world. It doesn't say اعلموا الدنيا. Know that this world is these things, these distracting things. It says, know that the lifestyle of this world. So when we're thinking about the bad side of the dunya, it's not about thinking about in total the entire dunya is bad and let's stay away from it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us the specific things that are actually bad and the specific things to overcome. So let's go through these things. No, let's find out what hayat dunya is. The first one, it tells us la'ib. So اعلموا إنما الحياة الدنيا لعب. La'ibun is translated into play. So this is, Tafsir al-Mizan says this is any goal that's imaginary. So playing is like, you're playing with toys, you're playing a video game, anything where the goals of that thing are imaginary. It's not something that's real. That's what la'ib translates to. And we'll go into these in a bit more detail shortly. The second thing is lahu. Lahu is translated into diversions or distractions. And it's anything that takes you from an actual goal. So say today you wanted to go to the gym, and instead you get distracted by something else. You find yourself scrolling on Instagram, or you're doing something to distract yourself. That's what lahu is. The third one is zina, not to be confused with zina. Zinatun is when you adornment or beautify something. Say we want to do zina to this hall over here, we put up paintings, balloons, and different things to make it look really nice. That's what zinatun is. In terms of how we can apply this to what it means for hayat dunya, this is when someone is trying to beautify themselves, not just physically, but as a status or different things like that as well. The fourth one is tafakhur. Tafakhur is boasting and pridefulness. This is when you say, look, I'm better than this person and I'm better than that person, and my status that's linked to the zinaha is better than this person, and my wealth is better than this person. That's what tafakhur bainakum means. So boasting among yourselves. And the final one says takathur fil amwali wal awlad. Takathur, not tafakhur. Takathur bil amwali wal awlad. Trying to increase both your money and your children. And this is where someone is, as this one's kind of obvious, but it's just trying to increase your wealth and increase your offspring and things like that. Now it's interesting to know here, now that we've kind of defined what each of these 5 words mean, the actual order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put these in, it's an actually very interesting order. So let's think of this now as not 5 different abstract things that hayat dunya is, and those 5 things, the Quran always tells us to avoid hayat dunya because it's bad and things like that. So not thinking of these as 5 different abstract things, but actually as the stages of life. So if you look at the order Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put it in, when we're children, what's the big thing that children like to do that brings them to hayat dunya? It's the la'ib. So play is the thing that distracts children. And I'm not saying play or la'ib is inherently bad. It's not a bad thing to play, especially for a child. We'll talk a bit more about this in a little bit. But that is the big thing that happens. And then that child grows up. And that child is now a young adult. Maybe he's 12 or 13 or 14 and is growing up a bit. And now is an adolescent. And what's the big thing for an adolescent that really connects you to the dunya, which takes it away as a distraction from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the thing then is that lahu, that distraction. So that's when you're an adolescent and you're doing random things to distract yourself. Salah's coming up and, let me just do this for another 5 minutes. That's the big thing as an adolescent. And that's what brings you to the dunya rather than taking you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you overcome this lahu and you grow up and you're finally a young adult. You may be 18, you're 19, you're 20. And the big thing then is zinatun. And many of us know when we're at that age, what the important thing for us is to make sure that we're presentable, we're looking good, you want that best rank, you want that most expensive thing, you want to be impressive. And obviously I'm not saying just because hayat dunya is zinatun, everyone, stop making yourself look presentable and rock up to the mosque in ripped up clothes. That's not what we're saying. But it's again, an over-obsession with zinatun brings you towards hayat dunya, and it brings you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then finally you've overcome that stage, or maybe you haven't. And the next thing in hayat dunya is the tafakhur. So now that you've yourself, what's the next thing? It's tafakhur. That next thing when you're not a young adult anymore, but you're a bit older, a bit more established, and it's trying to boast over other people. You see these people that are very connected to the dunya, they like putting other people down, and that's a very big sign of someone that's connected to hayat dunya. And then finally you overcome this stage, and you're now much more established in your life. You're having kids, and these things pull you towards the dunya. And when you're in that old age, it's takathur bil amwali wal awlad, and that's what is a sign of obsession to the dunya. When all you can think about is increasing your money and your wealth rather than your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because what do we know? We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ghani, He's the infinitely rich, He's the infinitely wealthy. And the actual true wealth in the akhirah and this dunya lies in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Overall, it's important to understand these 5 things are what are the dunya. When we think of the distractions of the dunya, it's the distractions of these 5 things that pull you towards the dunya rather than taking you towards the akhirah. But it's an over-obsession with these things that's really dangerous. So when I say these 5 things are here and avoid them, you also should be playing. You should be allowing your mind to be distracted from time to time. You should be presentable. You should have kids and you should provide for those kids. Those aren't things that you shouldn't be doing. They're actually Islamic. And I'm not just saying this randomly. I'll prove that in just a sec. But you need to make sure that you're also avoiding an over-obsession with hayat dunya, but on the same time, you're also allowing yourself to have some sort of backbone in this dunya as well, to allow yourself to do the basics to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, to prove to you that you should have a bit of la'ab, a bit of lahu, etc., let's look at this hadith from the Prophet. When I first heard this, I was actually shocked. Well, not really shocked, but I was very surprised, and it was very heartwarming the first time I heard it. This isn't the exact one I heard, but it's a very similar one to the one that I heard. So this one's from Bihar al-Anwar, and I'd like you to imagine this situation. So the Prophet had been invited out for lunch. So it's narrated by the companions. So imagine you're there and you can see the Prophet and he's having lunch with you. And then they look to where they're having lunch, and then they see Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. He's in that hallway and he's playing. He's a little child then. He's not really old, he's a little kid, and he's playing in that alleyway. Now the Prophet sees him and he turns around. And what does the Prophet do? He stands up from the dinner and then he runs towards Imam al-Hasan, and his arms are outstretched, he's chasing after Imam al-Hasan. And Imam Hassan is coming this way and going that way, and he's dodging the Prophet. And the Prophet is running after him, and they're both laughing. This is what we call la'ab, exactly how we would call it. And then the Prophet comes up to Imam al-Hasan and he finally catches him, and he grabs him from the chin here and from the top of the head, and he brings him closer and he gives him a kiss. Now, and then he tells him, Hassan is a part of me and I am a part of him, and God will love those who love him. And we can see here that the Prophet is playing, but there's an important reason behind that. So let's look at the 2 important things here. The first is that he's playing, but the second more important reason we see here is why is the Prophet playing with Imam al-Hasan? He does it so that he can build up Imam al-Hasan's personality. Remember, this is a child and is very impressionable. He's teaching Imam al-Hasan mercy, he's teaching kindness to the Imam, and is building up that status of Imam al-Hasan. And the Prophet here is using la'ab as a means to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is gaining that collective closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now we'll go back to our story. The man understands what hayat dunya is, and he knows that it's a distraction of this world, and he knows that he should avoid an over-obsession with these things. At the same time, he understands that sometimes these things are required, especially if it's to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But now that he has figured out what the bad half is, what he should be ignoring, he wonders, what's the thing that brings him closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead? What's the good aspect? The good here in this dunya, what is that? And to understand that, we need to understand the nature of actions. So every action we take has 2 outcomes. The first outcome of every action is the effect on this world. It's a thing that you can see right in front of you, and it's that zahir of something, that obvious and clear part of something. And on the other side, every action has a batin, something deeper inside it, and that's the effect on your soul. Let's take two examples so that this example kind of actually fits with something. We'll take fasting, for example. First of all, let's look at what it does physically. What's the physical part of fasting? And then we'll talk about the soul half. So inshallah, most of us are old enough to have fasted before, and we've all experienced this at some stage in our life. Imagine it's a really hot summer's day. Alhamdulillah wa shukr, we haven't had the Ramadan in summer for a while, so this example might not hit as hard as it would if this was in the middle of summer. But iftar is at 9 p.m, the temperature's 32 degrees, your suhoor was in so much of a rush, you couldn't even have your 8th cup of water. You know, it was a really difficult day today. And then you're in a rush and you're tired, and what do you physically gain from that fasting? You're hungry, you're thirsty, maybe you're sleepy. There's also health benefits, but we'll ignore those for the sake of this example. But you know, these are the things that you gain physically from fasting. But obviously we all know that if this was the only reason we fasted, we probably wouldn't have been fasting. But there's a deeper reason that affects our soul. So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. O you who believe, decreed upon you is fasting as it was decreed upon those before you, so that you may be those that have taqwa. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us what? He's telling us that fasting, you know the physical aspect, you've all experienced it. But on the deeper aspect, the one that actually affects your soul, fasting gives you taqwa. And that is the first thing. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always tell us? Allahu yuhibbul muttaqin. Allah loves those with taqwa. So now we understand that an action has an outside and an inside that affects the soul. And it's really important to know that all actions we take in our life, every halal, every haram, and those things like that, that all affects the soul. And that's the first thing to understand. Let's give another example. Let's look at something like backbiting. On face value, backbiting gives you some laughs, you get some giggles. Did you see what that guy did? That's the thing that backbiting kind of gives you. But that's the physical aspect. Let's look at what the soul aspect of backbiting gives you. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, it's like eating the flesh of your brother or eating the flesh of your sister. Imagine a plate is in front of you and has a name tag. You know how they put those little tags on burgers and it has the name? Imagine it has the name of your best friend and you have to, like, they force you to eat that. Imagine how traumatic that would be. Imagine for the rest of your life, you would be sobbing every time you remembered that thing. Now imagine when we backbite, we don't see that. But imagine what the soul sees every time you backbite. Imagine how that traumatizes the soul and how that affects the soul and causes a really deep gash in the soul. And when we sin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there's always a spot on the heart that can grow and cause further damage in the future. So the man understands the nature of the actions, but he wonders, what does this have anything to do? Like, what does developing the soul to do with his end goal, which is, you know, he wants to reach heaven, he wants to avoid hell. How does that have any connection to one another? And the answer to this one is actually quite simple. Now, inshallah, all of us understand actions affect your soul, and why that is important for your akhirah lies in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's take an example. So say that you're a teacher like Brother Zain over here, wonderful teacher, and you have 2 new students coming into your class. And now you need to fit each of these students into an elective. The first student, she loves to draw, you know, she's always drawing on the side of the pages, she's always taking the time out to draw and things like that, and she loves history as well. And the second student that comes in, he's a maths whiz, he loves maths so much. When he sees a discount on something and it says 20% off, it's like, finally I get to use 20% off in my day-to-day life. And then he's using that. Now, as a nice and merciful teacher like Brother Zain over here, what do you do with these students? You put the first student in the art elective. You put her where her kind of personality belongs, and you take the second student and put them in the maths elective, and you put that student where that student belongs. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does this in the same way. Heaven is a place of beauty and kindness and happiness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it as streams flowing and jannat and things like that. Such a nice description. And hell is quite the opposite. It's a place of heat, fire, anguish, torment, and a really disgusting place when you listen to it. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? Once a soul is developed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and those souls, this is from the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, those whose souls the angels take while they are virtuous, so those good, nice souls, the ones that are tayyibeen, the angels tell them Assalamu alaikum, and enter into paradise because of what you used to do. That's kind of the soul that gets to enter paradise. That soul that is tayyib enters into paradise. And on the opposite, if a soul is compatible with hellfire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells these souls with arrogance, they turn away from them with arrogance, and the gates of heaven shall not be open to them. These souls match hellfire, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of just matching the soul to where it belongs, puts this soul into hellfire, because that soul is compatible. So inshallah, that's why it's incredibly important for us to make sure our soul, because I assume we all want to go to heaven inshallah, to make a soul that is compatible with heaven. And that's what, should be in the back of our mind. Every action I take should build my soul in a way that brings me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that soul, at the same time, will bring me closer to heaven and take me further from hellfire. And that brings me to a very important point. Now that we've understood that actions have a further depth to them, we need to make sure that whenever we're doing any actions, we're closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of personality. And it's the actions in the Islamic way of life that can actually bring you closer to Allah. When we think back to the Prophet, we hear of all these actions he did, the way that he dealt with mercy, the way that he was forgiving, the way that he was wise, the way that with any situation came, the Prophet was dealing in this very amazing way. He had such an amazing akhlaq. And it's for good reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. We talked about this about a year ago. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting on this world a representative of him. So when the Prophet is acting in these ways, he's actually acting as a representation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions. The Prophet is thinking about these things and doing these things. In the same way, when we're around each other, when we're around our brothers and sisters and people outside of Islam and anyone in general, our family as well, we need to make sure that we act in the same way, a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be pleased, a way that we've been shown by the prophets and by the imams. You also need to act with mercy, you also need to have forgiveness, you also need to have that same wisdom. And you need to do that because every action you do, be it an act of worship or just an act of good akhlaq, will change your soul and bring you closer. By the way, akhlaq means like the behavior and the mannerisms. That's basically what that means. So all of these different things need to change your soul and bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A really simple trick to do this actually, and it's not too impossible, is before you do something or before you say something, you know how they always teach us when we're kids, you should think before you act and you should think before you open your mouth. You should try to think, what would the Prophet have said in this situation? If you're in an argument and things are getting heated, think, if the Imam was here, what would the Imam have done in this situation? How would the Prophet have fixed this? Before you make a big decision in your life, how would the Prophet have made this decision? And that's how we can gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and change that soul to make it match heaven, because we change our actions, our small little things that have a big impact on the soul. And sometimes you hear, okay, I need to change, I need to have that wisdom, I need to have that mercy, I need to have that kindness. And yet you find that difficult. You say, I'm not that kind of person. How do I change to become that kind of person? And the Prophet says in a hadith, it says, and the forbearance will overcome anger, and mercy will overcome harshness, and charity overcomes sin. And then Abu Abdullah alayhi salam is next to him and he says, there is more like this where one thing can overcome another. So if you're a very angry person and you wish you found a way to change that anger and get rid of that anger, know that forbearance is a way to get rid of the anger. You take out one bad aspect and you replace it with a good one. When you have harshness, you take out the harshness and you put in mercy. When you're a very sinful person, you take out that sin and you put inside that charity. And there's more things like this. Whenever you notice there's an attribute that you think, the Prophet probably didn't have this attribute. Allah probably doesn't want me to have this quality. I don't think this will change my soul to reach closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Try and remove that thing, but place something else in its place. Try change that badness with good. And that's a way to change the soul to gain closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's always important that whenever we do something in our day-to-day life, a lot of us are very busy people, we're always doing something. When we're doing that thing, try to have the intention that I'm doing this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you're going into work, say, I'm doing this because I want to get closer to Allah. That's my reason. When you're going to visit family, say, I want to do this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you're spending time with a child, be like, oh, this isn't a chore. This is a way for me to build up my soul and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So always, whenever you do something, ibda' bismillah, start with a bismillah before you do that thing, and try gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through every action that you do. And you might ask me, I'm building up the soul and I'm making it really good and all these things, but if heaven is perfect anyways, what's the point of all this really high effort working on my soul and making the correct actions? And the reason for that is the soul that we have in this world gets reflected in the next world. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I will resurrect you in Yawm al-Qiyamah, we're not coming up as physical bodies, we're coming up as these souls. The souls that we have developed throughout our life is what ends up coming back up. And if that soul was a very nice, kind, Islamic soul, it'll be resurrected as a nice, kind, and Islamic, soul. If that person was very harsh and angry and was always, raging and things like that, and away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when that soul gets resurrected, those signs of badness will be on that soul. So that soul, as if it's like a physical or a soul manifestation of what your actions have been in this dunya. So then the man asks, it's understood that this place is supposed to be for growth and changing your soul and getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it sounds like a very happy thing. But then the man asks, why does he find it so difficult to enjoy this world? Why is this world such a difficult place? The man asks, and he wonders, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to build up our souls, but He puts so many difficult things in front of us? Why is that the case? Now, we spoke a lot now about how we want to develop our souls, how we should choose our day-to-day actions, how we should do that extra care in our intentions and our worship. But I've intentionally left something out because I want to bring this up towards the end. And it's something very important. The first thing to understand is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world, not an easy place. It's not an easy place, this world. He created it and He introduced this aspect of difficulty to this world. Everyone in this world, every single person experiences hardship. Whether you're rich or you're poor or you're famous or you're lonely, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not leave anyone out of this difficulty. Those that are poor struggle to make ends meet. The rich people, even though they have so much money, they suffer from this emptiness. The famous person has so many people around them, yet they don't feel any connection with anyone. And the lonely person in the same way doesn't have any connection with anyone. All of these different things. People, when they try to rebut Islam and when they try to rebut religion, what do they say? They say, if God exists, then why is there so much, and your God says He's kind and He says He's merciful, why is there so much pain and destruction in the world? That's what they try to rebut religion with. Why is there natural disasters? Why are there wars? Why is there death? If there was a God, He would have made everything really easy, is what they say. And, for example, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow the things in Palestine to keep on happening? Why doesn't He just, remove all the bad and, get rid of that? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit such difficulty to exist in the world? And you might be confused now that you're thinking about it. It sounds like it doesn't make sense. Why is there so much difficulty in the world? And the Quran, as always, has an answer to these questions. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ألم نشرح لك صدرك ووضعنا عنك وزرك الذي أنقض ظهرك ورفعنا لك ذكرك. And here's where the important ayah comes. It's really important. فإن مع العسر يسرا. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeats it again. إن مع العسر يسرا. Indeed, with the hardship comes ease. And then again, indeed, with the hardship comes ease. It's repeated twice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to us, and He wants us to really understand that hardship and ease are on the same side. On one side you have that difficult thing in your life, but on the other side there's ease. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they're connected to each other. Because hardship is the biggest catalyst for change in the soul. When you think, it sounds like a very hard thing to change as a person and to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us difficulty. He gave it for a reason. Because you notice the people that change the most and the strongest people have gone through such hard things in their life. You notice that this hardship, whenever you overcome it, you feel like you've changed as a person, because the hardship is a catalyst. A catalyst is something that speeds something up. The hardship is a catalyst that gives your soul ease, both in this dunya and the next. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عَبْدِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. If your servant asks about me, and is talking to the Prophet, know that I'm near. Know that when you're going through this difficulty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't leaving you to do this on your own. He knows, I'll give you this hard thing and I want you to overcome it. And the reason I want you to overcome this and make the right decision is because I want you to get closer to me. I want your soul to change, to become such an amazing soul. And that big change happens. It's with that ease that Zainab alayhi salam, what does she say in Karbala when they ask her, what did you see? She says, La ra'ayta illa jamila. I saw nothing but beauty. And how can she say this when all she saw was, infants dying and Imam al-Hussein is dying and all these difficult things are happening? But what's the reason? She sees that in that hardship, there was so much ease. She saw these souls that went through such hardship. They went through Karbala, they went through all these difficult things, and that gave them infinite closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's through looking at this and reflecting on this, it's her soul that has built up and seen the true nature of the events of reality. And she's understood the beauty of Karbala, not just the difficulty, but the beautiful thing happening in Karbala. When we reach that point and hardship comes to us, you find it like, I was missing this, alhamdulillah wa shukr, because now I can get closer to you, ya Allah. Now this is an excuse for me to overcome this and get closer to you. And this isn't just something that the Imams can attain and the Prophets can attain. This is something that all of us can strive towards and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when things are difficult, make sure that you have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let Him manage your affairs and do your part and take a step towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you with the rest of your journey. When you go through that hardship and you finally overcome it, you start to understand things like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I'm closer to you than your jugular vein. You think, what does that really mean? But when you're going through those hardships and you finally start to feel that your soul is connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have such a big change in you and you feel that soul get really, you feel like a new person now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you with the hardship. And now that we've gone through the hardship and if hardship is coming up or you've had previous hardship that you haven't recovered from, it's important to remember that we need to live in the moment and we make sure that we're focused on the present moment. A quote that's often attributed to Imam Ali reads, how strange and foolish is a man who loses his health in gaining his wealth, and then he regains his health and he wastes his wealth. And then he ruins the present, and this is the important part. He ruins the present by worrying about the future, and he weeps in the future by recalling the past. And he lives as though death shall never come to him, and he dies in a way that was never born. Imam Ali is warning us, alayhi salam, that we should always, whenever we're going through something in this dunya, make sure that you're present and you're there. Don't be worrying about what's about to come. Don't be worrying about what's already happened. Make sure that you're worrying about the here and now. Imagine it's like writing a book. So imagine there's a pen and it's writing a book. And this pen, it's not focused on the things it's already written. It's not worried about the pages and what it should have scribbled out before. And it's not worried about the things it hasn't even written yet. That pen, when it's writing the book, is focused on that current letter. It does the correct stroke. Then the letter comes out looking good. The word looks good. The sentence looks good. The paragraph looks good. And then that whole entire page looks good. And then every page, because that pen is focused on the present moment, ends up becoming beautiful. And that's the same way that we should be living our lives. Make sure that the current letter that you're writing in the story of your life is one that you've focused on and one that you've chosen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you through. And those are the decisions and the choices that you should make to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you've made the wrong decisions and if you've done the wrong things and you worry, how can I get back on track? I'm so far away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've spent, the last 20, 30 years, of the last 10 years making the wrong decisions, and every time difficulty came to me, I chose the wrong option. Remember how Muhammad Raslan talked about to us in the last program about dopamine and serotonin and how, if you get stressed and you choose the wrong option, you get further away from the way of Islam and the way of developing yourself as a person. In the same way, if you found yourself, separated from Islam and separated from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you worry, remember how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses Himself. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَن يَعْمَلْ سُوءًا أَوْ يَظْلِمْ نَفْسَهُ ثُمَّ يَسْتَغْفِرَ اللَّهَ يَجِدَ اللَّهَ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. Whoever commits evil or wrongs themselves, and see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying you wrong yourself. Whenever you sin, whenever you do bad, You're not wronging Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not get affected. The only person that's affected is you. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us? He finds Allah is going to be the most forgiving, the most merciful. That's who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. That's who you're saying astaghfirullah to. When you're thinking about the things that you've done wrong in your life, you don't need to say astaghfirullah 1,000,000 times to be forgiven. But if you in your heart really mean an astaghfar, you just need to say it one time, astaghfirullah. But you mean that with the proper intention. You say it in such a way that your soul gets changed. That brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That changes you. That is what will be forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we'll wrap up for prayer and then we'll come back after to talk about some practical tips about the things we talked about. But let's just go back quickly to our story to kind of summarize before we go off to prayer. So we need to understand that the experiences in this life and the challenges in this life are all here to develop the soul and the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think of the dunya less as just as a test. I'm not being tested here only. The real thing here is it's like a training ground that brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every decision you make, everything you do, every time you avoid hayat dunya and you choose to worship Allah and you choose to focus on developing your akhlaq, and every time you're in an argument and you want to shout and you think, actually the Prophet would have liked me to, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have liked me to say something like this instead. Every time you do that, you change your soul, and every time you do that, your soul becomes one that matches the Jannah, inshallah. And inshallah, for now, we'll wrap up for now and we'll inshallah move on to prayer, and we'll come back later and we'll talk about some practical tips to do these things and to implement these lessons into our lives. So can we have a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad?
So you just tell everyone to do wudu if they haven't already.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Inshallah, now, as mentioned by our brother Amir, we'll be having salah. If you need to do your wudu, or the bathrooms are on the right hand side. And may be able to do them in the kitchen, just pick with some of the barakah stuff for that, and we'll begin salah now. Before we continue with the second half of Brother Amir's speech, we'd just like to first have a couple of announcements from our brother Saleh. Can we please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Just a few announcements. As you may have heard, this is the last Friday program for the year, but there will be a few other programs that will continue. So as you know, there's the Barakah book club, which was started in the middle of this year, and alhamdulillah, an entire book was completed, and so now a new book will be starting for the new year. In the meantime, we're going through short articles. So it's a perfect time to join if you would like to join onto the circle that attends the book clubs. The only thing that we would say is that you have to be dedicated if you want to join, because the idea is that you keep coming to these sessions. It's not just you come once and that's it. And we've pretty much already reached capacity. So we only want dedicated people to join now, and it's a perfect time to join given that a new book will start for the new year. And this is a new book, Religious Authority and Political Thought in 12 Shiism. And if you'd like to join, you can always talk to Brother Nicholas, who facilitates these programs. And on the girls' side, you can talk to Sabah or any of our other members. So the next thing that we want to talk to you about is the Barakah Hawza Study Club. This is a new initiative, it's a new program. The idea is that whoever has already started Hawza or anyone that's interested to start Hawza can do so online, and you can learn at your own pace. But we will try to get a study club going so that we can sort of share our ideas, share what we learn from these sort of Hawza lessons online. And it's also to encourage people. So like when you come together and you see other people are continuing, might push you to keep going and maybe eventually get a diploma and just keep going that way. So the next thing is the Ramadan program. So the Ramadan program, we had the first Ramadan English program this year, 2023. We worked with our brothers and sisters at One Light, and alhamdulillah, it was something that hadn't been done in Melbourne before, so we didn't have an English Ramadan program. And with your help, with your attendance, with your funds, we were able to run 22 nights out of the 30 nights of Ramadan. So in those nights we had iftars, we had lectures. We read a juz'u each night until the 30th juz'u. We tried to do other things as well. We tried to do discussions with our guest speaker in the park. We tried to do some late night discussions, obviously just for the boys and those sort of discussions. At night time with our guest speaker, we did some suhoor sessions as well. So we have even bigger plans this year, because this was the first time we've ever run it. This year will be even better, inshallah. So if you go to the next slide, Amir. The idea is that, click one more. I think, yeah, so the idea is that last year we managed to run everything with limited funds, so our budget was 10K. To give you an idea, a Muharram program sometimes costs about 5K to run one night, so we did 22 with 10K. This year, we are asking for 15K, inshallah, and we will utilize those funds as best as we can, just like we did in this year's program. And for any sort of donation counts, so $5, $10 helps. The only thing we ask is that you put in the description Ramadan, because that's the only way we'll know it's specifically for the Ramadan program coming next year. We've already been planning for a long time. As some of you that may have attended one of our other sessions, we ran a polis sort of activity where we got your feedback, and based on your feedback we managed to get a speaker that is more youthful. The speaker is Sheikh Muhsin from Sydney, so we've secured him for next Ramadan, the whole of Ramadan. We've also secured Masjid Ahl al-Bayt as our venue for the whole month as well. Our iftars, based on our estimates, will cost about $1,000 to run an iftar. So if you want an iftar in your thawab, you can do that as well. So donate generously. We'll keep the slide up there for the rest of the talk. And if you'd like to donate, then the details are there. Just make sure you write Ramadan. That's the most important part. And thank you. Saleh ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you, Laith, for those announcements. And yes, as always, it's always great to have your support. Of course, there's the monetary stuff which we, need to run these day-to-day programs. But of course, just turning up, if you can't support us monetarily, is always appreciated as well. We'd now like to continue with the Amir's talk, where he'll inshallah be giving us some practical tips. Salawat.
Let's have another loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
All right, so let's continue where we left off about 20 minutes ago. So last time we were talking about how we have this difficulty in this dunya that helps us get closer to Allah in the akhirah. So now let's summarize everything that we've learned up until this point, and then we'll talk about some practical tips so that we can incorporate each thing we talked about today into our lives. So the first thing we talked about today was about the hayat al-dunya and that distinction between hayat al-dunya and the dunya. Then we talked about how every action we do has a true nature behind it, and a true intention behind that action is what actually ends up changing the soul. And then we talked about how the importance of changing the soul is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts each soul into the environment it matches into. So we need to develop ourselves that it matches that beautiful environment of heaven by incorporating that kindness, that mercy, that those different things that connect you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is what ends up allowing your soul to enter heaven. And then we have to also always remind ourselves of the purpose of the journey in this life. And then we also talked about how we have to slow down and appreciate the things that Allah has given us, especially the difficulty. So that's what we talked about up until this point. So now let's try break it down and go into some practical tips on how we can actually incorporate these things that we learn. So the first thing to do is to avoid spending our time in the hayat dunya lifestyle. Again, we're talking about hayat dunya, the lifestyle of this earth. So when we decide to do some la'ab, when we decide to do some lahu, we make sure that we do it either for the sake of Allah, like we saw the Prophet was playing with Imam al-Hassan for the sake of Allah. We either do that la'ab to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if not, make sure that it's minimal and it's not pulling us away from Allah and it's not pulling us so close to the dunya. Because we have to remember that our end goal is to, again, build up that soul to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we do some zinatun, make sure we're doing it, when we're doing that, make sure it's to be presentable. Make sure it's not done in excess. Make sure it's not done that it leads you to a point at which you're arrogant. And, tafakhur, when we talked about how that is boasting among one another, this thing is better to avoid altogether, because that boasting, that arrogance, that thing develops a very bad disease in the heart. And that disease is that, what are you doing really when you're arrogant? You're saying, I'm greater. But what do we know? We know Allahu Akbar. God is always greater. So what are you doing when you're doing that arrogance and when you're boasting and things like that? Inherently what you're doing is you're putting yourself up there and then you're worshipping the image that you've put. And what is this? Arrogance is just another form of shirk. And that's why you need to avoid that kind of thing. So again, it's always important to avoid that tafakhur bainakum. And then finally, you mustn't focus solely on increasing the wealth and our children. Of course, have kids and provide for those kids. But with that leftover money, don't just let it build up, because that's not going to do anything for us all. That's not going to let you get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what can you do with that excess money? And it's always, you can use it and buy something for yourself in the akhirah. Do charity and do it honestly, do it in private, do it in a way that will actually cause a change in your soul. When you give charity and when you kind of feel like you've actually helped someone, it's a huge impact on your life. Those that have, given and felt that feeling, that there's nothing that comes close to that feeling. So that's what we should do. So with those aspects of the hayat dunya, keep them in mind. Think about, what stage are you in? How old are you? What do you match into? Like we said from that, like they match the stages of life. So think about where you are and how you can avoid those things. The second thing to do, so this is moving on now, is to remember the true nature of the actions we do. Remember that everything has an outside kind of thing that you'll see in front of you, but everything else also has an inside, a batin inside it. Make sure that the things we do bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the things we avoid bring us also closer to Allah. So we avoid the things that take us away, and we do the things that bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you're not experiencing this, if you're doing salah and you're not feeling it, if you're making a dua and you're not feeling it, think, what is my intention behind this? What am I trying to gain here? Is it that I'm trying to change my soul to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is there an issue with my intention? Is there an issue with the way I'm approaching worship? And remember that on the other side, when you're sinning and you're making these mistakes, if you accidentally fall into sin, remember, it's not just a negative minus 50 points for lying, minus 10 points for backbiting, but you're creating that spot in your heart, that dark black spot in the heart. And that makes both this world and the next world more miserable, because your soul changes to a negative way, and that soul experiences both this dunya and the next and the akhirah in such a different and worse way. So we must remember, when we do fall into sin, make sure that you ask for forgiveness, and you ask for that forgiveness genuinely, and you really mean it, and you really want to change. Now, the third practical tip is to remind ourselves constantly of the purpose of the journey of this life. Don't think of it as just a test. I need to pass or I need to fail. Make sure you get that deeper connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Use this world as a training ground and really get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the different things you do. You need to keep that in mind and make sure that everything you do, you're developing your ruh throughout this life. And you need to make sure that you do things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be pleased with. Make sure that, when you pick to do something, it's something that the Prophet would have done. It's something that the Imam would have done. It's something that an example of yours would have done. Pick role models from the stories that we have of the Ahlul Bayt and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through that and change the ruh through that. The fourth thing is to slow down in your day-to-day life and appreciate the world that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created and use that as a way to get closer to Allah. So get out of the house, don't just stay locked indoors and forgetting about the world around us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, and try to experience those things. The same way that the Prophet used to leave and go to the mountain to ponder on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you too, when you're outside, try to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, try to ponder on the things. And it's not just outdoors. I'm saying get outside because there's a lot to experience out there. But everything you do, every action, every emotion you experience, think of how is this affecting my ruh? How is this affecting my connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Notice those little things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing for you. Make sure that when you're doing your day-to-day actions in your life, make them for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you can manage to, do the things in your 9 to 5 with the intention of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll notice a big difference because every single day you're getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, let's say you're working in a hospital. When I'm there, you see a lot of sick people. Then it's a very difficult place. Say you're working and you see people, going through different tough times and things like that. Take that extra 10 seconds, give them a smile, ask how they're doing, try to make sure that they're doing better. Because while you might notice it as a small thing and, I'm not really doing anything here, I'm just smiling. But that's a deep impact that helps that person, and it helps both build up them, but it also helps build up your soul. And that's why the Prophet tells us a smile is a big form of charity. Make sure we're doing those little day-to-day things that get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Brother has given me a beautiful smile from the audience. And then the fifth thing is to remember that this world is designed to be difficult. It's not an easy place, and you should remember that. When you go through hardship, be it big or small, it doesn't need to be a huge thing that you term hardship. It's not like as big as losing a loved one or something. Sometimes it's a really small thing that's a hardship for you. It's, traffic on the way to work today or something. I know I have a friend that calls me and complains about traffic all the time. He's going to look up at me in 2 seconds from now. But, when you're going through those difficulties in your life, make sure that you always remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed them there on purpose, because He knows each and every single hardship that you're experiencing is going to develop your soul and bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And know that when you're entering into those hardships and you feel overwhelmed and you feel like it's too much, remember what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah. What does it say? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Allah does not burden any soul beyond its capacity. Everything you go through, trust in Allah that you will be able to overcome that thing, and you'll always be able to find a way to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by defeating that hardship and getting your ruh to be built up and get closer to Allah. And don't be afraid of doing things that are hard for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't say, I can't do this right now, it's way too difficult, I'll never be able to do it. Remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closer to you than your jugular vein, and is there to help you overcome and beat that hardship and get closer to Him. Because He's the one that picked out the hardship for you, and you can use that to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you slip up and maybe that hardship took you further from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, use that as another opportunity to get closer to Allah. Ask for forgiveness, do it genuinely. Make dua and do it genuinely, and try to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And use that time in between activities to get closer to Allah. If you have nothing to do and you're really bored, maybe try to listen to a story, try to look at a hadith, do something really small to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Use those different things to gain closeness to Allah. So inshallah, we've all understood today kind of the way that we should be embarking of the journey of the soul, using Islam, using that to gain a difference in our soul, and the difference in the soul is what gets you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that helps you succeed in the dunya and the akhirah. Let's inshallah all make a dua today to attain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to build that bond between us and Allah. Let's all make a dua that we can really change our souls for the better and get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I ask you all for your du'as inshallah, and let's also make a dua for the people of Palestine. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Ahsant, brother Amir. Can we please have another loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? I'd like to thank you for providing us with the fundamentals about how we should regulate ourselves in Hayat al-Dunya, and making it especially entertaining with all your stories and analogies. As always, inshallah, we'll be able to use this information that you've given us today to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both in this world and in the hereafter. We would now like to begin our interactive segment, which will inshallah be run by Brother Hussein Fiyal. Can we please welcome him with another loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Bro, I cannot hear a thing of that.
Very fun, my donation. Be careful,
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alrighty,
So, I will stand out of the way here. So, as you guys may or may not remember, about a year ago, I spoke in the other centre about creating some sort of app that has a collation of all the maqamat and ziyarat all over the Middle East. Alhamdulillah, after a year of working on it, it's finally been released, and I'm sure a lot of you have downloaded it. So I just want to speak to you about a couple of features before we go on to our interactive segment. So as I said, it's pretty much an app that collates a lot of the maqamat and the maraqid all over the Middle East. And so it's all there for you guys in one place. Next slide. In each place there is also a description of each shrine, about a little bit about the history, who's buried in those shrines, as well as navigation to each of those shrines based on where you are. We've also got different shortcuts to different cities, or popular cities that contain a lot of or most of the shrines. And we also currently have the app in both English and Arabic, and we also have plans to expand the languages and include Farsi and other languages. So I guess in order to kind of promote this app, we're going to be playing a bit of a game. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with GeoGuessr. So we're going to try to divide ourselves up in 3 groups. So 3 groups from the brothers, 3 groups from the sisters. I'll give you guys 2 minutes. And for the game, you have to download the app in order for it to be helpful. So you're going to use it as a tool to help you guys. Okay. So I'll give you guys 2 minutes to set yourselves up.